All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. We have it's the end of the year here, so there aren't very many students around, but it's wonderful to see so many of you online. Thank you, Judith, for offering to give this talk. Judith really needs no introduction to the Geotalks because for many years she ran the Geotalks, and so I'm sure you all remember her from there. And thank you for doing that for so many years. Judith is a visiting professor here in the School of Geosciences, but joined the school in 1999. And has been with us ever since. She's also the Deputy Director of Chimera, and before that, the Director of the Economic Geology Research Institute. And before that, she did her graduate degrees in Scotland and has worked extensively in many different industries, too many to mention. But she has said that one of the only deposits that she has yet to see is nickel laterite deposits. So it's wonderful having your experience here, Judith. Thank you so much, and enjoy the talk, everybody. Over to you, Judith.
Okay, thank you, Grant, and welcome to all of those you online, especially those connecting from Namibia. You're very welcome. I stood in at short notice because the speaker for today pulled out. And so in the best practices of the green economy, I'm recycling the talk. So the title is What Africa Can Offer for a Greener Future. Now, according to a World Bank report in 2020, a low carbon economy will use more minerals because solar, voltaic and wind power all require more energy, more mineral materials than fossil fuel energy needs. And so that's good news for geologists because it means more mining, more jobs. And to achieve the climate goals as outlined in the Paris Agreement of keeping global warming to less than 2 degrees, a lot more of these technologies are required to produce wind and solar and wave energy. Now, the issue is that currently the world population is about 8 billion, but by 2050, it will be up to about 10 billion. And the problem is that all of these people want to improve their living standards, whether it's for new homes and offices, whether it's for fridges, cars and roads, computers, televisions, phones, even jet military fighters, etc. And we also need mined products for agriculture. So we need a lot of mining. Now that brings me to critical metals. Critical metals are those that are required by the economy of a country. So if for Germany, for example, they might be interested in what's needed for cars, whereas South Korea might be interested in what's needed for computers. So the point is that critical metals vary from time to time and from place to place. If you look at the screen here on the left, you can see British Geological Survey critical metals, and I've just used 2012 and 2015 as examples, but you can see that in 2012, the top commodities that were really on the high risk list were rare earths, tungsten and antimony. But by 3 years later, that had changed to include bismuth, and tungsten had been sort of relegated slightly lower down the list. So you can see even within one country, the what's at risk changes from time to time. And then as you look at this table here, you can see that the United States also has rare earths at the top that includes things like tellurium and indium. So critical metals vary from time to time and place to place. I seem to have missed a slide here, but materials can be critical in terms of the source of supply, how many countries can supply that material, the political stability of that country, and the availability of that material. For instance, some things don't occur as their own minerals, but they occur within other minerals. For instance, germanium tends to occur in zinc minerals. And if we don't want to mine zinc, then where are we going to get our germanium from? So we have to take into account criticality. And using a South African example, what I'm showing here is criticality in terms of production. So you can see on the for platinum in 2021, South Africa produced 74%, but back when Zuma was president, America considered South Africa politically unstable. So where was their second option? Russia. Oh, where was their third option? Zimbabwe. So it was regarded by many as a very critical material because only 3 countries were producing 90%. And similarly with rhodium, South Africa, Russia, and Zimbabwe produce most of the world's rhodium. Now, at the moment, South Africa is producing about an equal amount of palladium with Russia. And although Norilsk in Russia has expanded its output, as we develop the mines on the northern limb of the Bushveld, we'll be producing much more palladium here than we have in the past. So we will be producing, probably by 2025, we'll be the world's leading producer of palladium. When you look at these 3 graphs here, what are these materials used for? And you can see that a very large slice of the pie is for catalytic converters. Now, back a few years ago, there were either platinum catalytic converters. Hi, Barry, you got the right day. Bless you.
It's Thursday.
And it's first Thursday later on, so you can go and enjoy a beer.
Here I haven't forgotten.
A few years ago, we either used platinum in catalytic converters or palladium with maybe a little bit of rhodium. But recent technology has shown that if you use proportions of all 3 of those elements, you get better uptake of these obnoxious sort of gases. If we look at the top table here, we can see that at the beginning of the 20th century, we only used about 20 elements as common metals. If you look at the lower periodic table, you can see that virtually everything is used for something, whether the rare earths for lighting or lithium, cobalt, nickel for energy storage. All these different colors indicate what these elements are used in and for. So as we go forward to try and limit to lower our use dependence on carbon for power, we need increased production of a lot of the elements. And if you look at the bar graphs here, it shows you what the increase is going to be that's needed to keep a functional technology between now and 2050. And you can see that there's an increased need for graphite, lithium, cobalt, and the increase in percentage is huge. However, a caution, everybody's looking for lithium at the moment, for lithium-ion batteries. But if another technology is found, then the demand for lithium could drop very, very quickly. But as you look at those graphs, and we focus for a moment on lithium and cobalt, in looking at lithium, it's the key ingredient, as you all know here, for lithium-ion batteries. And although we sort of think about the use in cars, we also need them in laptop batteries, in our cell phones, and in our electric tools. And The need for lithium in lithium-ion batteries is well shown in these two pie graphs here. If you look at the data there for 2011, you can see that the use of lithium in batteries was 27% of the overall use. And then if you look at the upper left diagram, you can see that by 2020, 71% of the lithium was being used for lithium-ion batteries. So in 10 years, the requirement for lithium for batteries has increased from 27 to 71% of the total lithium production. And all the other uses of lithium are still there, so everybody else is clamoring for lithium. And the bar graph there shows the increased metal prices in 2021 for things like lithium, magnesium, and cobalt, as everybody's paying a bit more to get what they need. So as geologists, we want to know where lithium comes from. And I think everybody's aware of the igneous source, particularly in pegmatites, but there's also sedimentary sources and brine sources. And the main source of lithium in the world at the moment is in salars in the lithium triangle in South America. These are lakes fed by brines that have extracted lithium from volcanics, and they are the main source of lithium. But if you look at the grade tonnage diagram on the bottom right, you can see that there's different sorts of lithium sources. You've got igneous, sedimentary, and brine, and that area in orange shows that the grade is very low, but the tonnages can be very high. And the lake there, Uyuni in Bolivia, is a huge, huge potential source for lithium. So we don't have any deposits like that in Africa, but what we do have is an abundance of pegmatites. And every man and his dog is scrambling to look for these lithium-bearing pegmatites at the moment. We've got Archean pegmatite shown in blue in Zimbabwe. We've got Kibaran pegmatite shown in red in Central Africa. We've got Pan-African pegmatite shown in yellow around various parts of Africa. And these pegmatites can be zoned or homogeneous, and they can show graphic intergrowth, directional growth banding, very fine grain zones. Everybody always thinks of a pegmatite as being very coarse, but you can have very coarse banded zones. You can have micro crystalline bands, so they're not always just very large crystals. The pictures there are from Bakita in Zimbabwe, and it's an interesting facet of these lithium deposits, because many of these big pegmatite deposits were originally mined for tin, like Greenbushes in Australia, or Bakita here. And then when tin became less sexy and tantalum was what everybody wanted, they were mined for tantalum, and sometimes the tailings were reprocessed. Many of those pegmatites are also being mined now for lithium, and Bakita has been mined for the last 75 years, but originally, as I say, started out for tin mining. If we look at the graph here, we can see data that Paul compiled showing the grades and tonnages of the ore. Now, if you're looking at a lead zinc deposit, you're looking for a grade of around 10%. If you're looking for an aluminium deposit, you're looking for grades of about 35% upwards of your commodity. And what so many mining companies don't quite understand is how low the grade is of even some of the biggest deposits that are mined for lithium. So we've just mentioned Bakita, and I'm just going to show a few examples of these pegmatite deposits, because Kamativi, shown here, is one of those that's abandoned at the moment because it was originally mined for tin. But now they're looking at the tailings and the potential for hard rock mining to produce lithium from the same deposit that's been mined for tin. Arcadia is in the north, about 45 kilometers northeast of Harare. And like many of the other pegmatites that have got a lot to give, you can see that there's stacked pegmatites, and there's up to 14 of these stacked on top of each other in a long stripe. And it's one of the largest JORC compliant lithium resources that's out there at the moment. Namibia, like Zimbabwe, has many pegmatites, and you can see a diagram in the middle there with a series of belts of pegmatites labeled A to F. And I've just chosen a few of these. The petalite pegmatite in the top right has obviously been mined for petalite. And the picture in the middle of pelican pegmatite, that's also been mined for petalite. But the issue is that in many of these pegmatites, such as the Rubicon pictures on the bottom from Louisa Ashworth's PhD, you can see that there's a petalite zone shown there at the left and middle photograph, but a lot of that has been mined over the decades. But what you've got is a lepidolite zone, a lithium-bearing mica zone. Now there's a lot of material there, and the problem is that until very recently, we haven't been able to get the lithium out of the lithium mica.
All right. Made it worse.
He said he was going to stop the noise. It's made it worse.
Trying to make it better. So.
Can you put up with
I can put up with you. Okay, so Namibia has great prospects if we can now extract the lithium from the lithium micas. Looking at a couple of other projects in the DRC, Manono Kitololo, and Mali, Gulamina, you can again see that there's a number of pegmatites within the area, and many of these have tin and niobium tantalum as well as lithium. And you can see that Manono Kitololo is about 15 kilometers in length and 800 meters wide in that zone in orange and red there. And they have good grades of lithium. So this is obviously something that's going to be really developed for the future. So we've got a lot to offer in terms of lithium. Now, how about cobalt? Well, everybody in this audience knows about the Central African copper belt. And so I'm not going to talk about copper, but I do want to mention cobalt, because that's very important in lithium ion batteries. And you can see that the Zambian copper belt and the Congolese copper belt, and everything changes at the border. The geology changes, the beer changes, the bread changes, and the language changes. So if we look at the bottom right, you can see a stratigraphic diagram showing what's in Zambia on the right-hand side and what's in DRC on the left-hand side. Now, you can see that in the Zambian stratigraphy, we've got what's called RAT at the bottom, Roche Argileux Talqueuse, and that is a acidiclastic unit, and the mineralization is very much sort of at the top of the rat in the mines, base of mine succession. Whereas if you contrast that with the stratigraphy in the DRC, you can see that there's very little siliciclastic material above the rat, and instead there's a great thickness of dolomites. Looking to the diagram on the left, created by Griff Gigler in his PhD in 2018, you can see that there's the siliciclastic material at the bottom, the lilac rat and the grey rat. These are grey sort of argillaceous material. And then above that, you've got the carbonate rocks. And you can see the copper profile in the green line, and that shows that there's two horizons enriched in copper, and also there's two horizons, or perhaps three, enriched in cobalt, and they're not necessarily at the same stratigraphic level as the copper. But what we see if we look at the producers of cobalt in the world, you can see that the main producers are Congo, but there's also a contribution from Madagascar and Morocco and South Africa, so that we are making a major contribution in Africa to the world's cobalt supply. 42% of that is going into batteries, and these lithium-ion batteries. And if you look at the bottom right, you can see that we have a lithium cobalt compound in the cathode in these lithium-ion batteries. There's a lot of other uses for cobalt. It's used in magnets and in the chemical industry as a catalyst. But the major use that is growing is for its use in batteries. If we now look at vanadium, shown by these symbols here, you can see that there's vanadium available all the way around the eastern and western limbs, and in the northern limb of the bushveld complex. There's somewhere around 25 layers of magnetite in the upper zone, and these comprise magnetite, obviously, with titanium and vanadium substituting for ferric iron. And as you can see here in this diagram, the greatest concentration of vanadium tends to be around this main magnetite layer. But I've got a PhD student, Troth Sandy, who's doing a part-time PhD, and he's the manager of Vametco, and has access to a lot of data, and is showing that there are other horizons a bit higher up with higher vanadium. So typical grades are about 1.5 to 2.2% vanadium pentoxide. The ore at Mapox mine here out in the east was about 1.6% vanadium. The active Vametco mine down here in Brits is mining an average of about 2.1% vanadium pentoxide. And in the northern limb up here, there's slightly lower, but very consistent grades around the complex. And in these two pictures here, you can see the main magnetite layer, this one here, over in magnetite in that part of the bushveld complex. So what proportion of vanadium does South Africa contribute? Well, you can see that compared to China, we have quite a small slice of the pie. At the moment, most of the vanadium is going into steels, but you can see that energy storage, etc., is only accounting for about 2% at the moment. but it's projected that as we develop these vanadium flow batteries, that slice of the pie will go up and up and up and up. And the mines where we're producing from at the moment are mainly over in the Brits area from the Vametco mine. Moving now to another part of Africa and another commodity, aluminium from Guinea is extremely important. And you can see that Guinea has quite a reasonable slice of the pie. And it only produces about 15% of global production, but it has about 26% of the world's bauxite reserves. Bauxite is a mixture of different aluminium minerals. And Guinea is one of the most poverty-stricken and unequal countries in the world. And because it has a considerable proportion of reserves, it's producing a lot less than it could. So it has a lot of potential prospects, but there's at the moment, it really is suffering the resource curse of international companies coming in, mining the commodity, and the country not really benefiting. And the government has dictated that by the end of October, a few days ago, companies must put in a plan for beneficiation and increased reward for the country, so that the country can benefit more from the reserves and resources that it has. And this is quite a useful example, because the World Bank says that 81 countries accounting for 25% of world GDP and 50% of the world's population, that's nearly 70%, live in extreme poverty. And the situation in Guinea emphasizes this quite considerably. In South Africa, we're well aware of what South Africa can offer in terms of iron ore. And most of us have perhaps been to Sishen, this enormous open cast mine that is 14 kilometers long. There is Sishen there. And you can see the stratigraphy done by Nick Bucas, where you can see several iron ore chemical sediments within the stratigraphy there. And the ore is mined, taken to the plant and processed, etc. And the jute plant at Sishen is one of the largest of its type in the world. But even though we produce vast amounts of iron ore, you can see from this graph here that the proportion that South Africa contributes to the world economy is pretty small compared to Australia, Brazil, and China. In the same area, we have the manganese horizon, which extends considerably further north than Sishen. And we've got the Kalahari manganese area here, where we have high grade here close to thrusting and much lower grade down here in the Mamatlan area. And it's a very unexciting mine scenario to go to. Everything is black. But you can see that the manganese horizons are above those of the iron rich horizons, although obviously the iron rich horizons have manganese in, and the manganese rich horizons have some iron in as well. But that's because these are above the iron rich layers, because they needed more oxygen for the manganese to be concentrated. And this represents sort of the snowball earth time, an increasing oxygen sufficient to deposit the manganese. If we look at the World Market Review, we can see that South Africa has a large proportion of the pie, and that pie, some of that now is for power. I can't work out which color is which. This one is power storage for electricity for a greener economy. I've looked at some of the major elements. Now I want to just briefly look at some of the minor elements, such as antimony. We used to produce quite a lot of antimony from this antimony line, which is here on the Tabazimbi Murchison lineament up here in the northeast. And you can see that there are ore bodies labeled here in this red color within a quartz carbonate schist, and the ore mineral is stibnite. And you can see in this slide here, you can see a very rich stibnite vein in these quartz carbonate rocks. The major use for antimony is in flame retardants. Now you might wonder, what has that got to do with the green economy? Well, as we try and build cars out of lighter material and use much more plastics and things in cars, we will need to have antimony to help reduce a fire risk. So germanium is one of those commodities which I mentioned much earlier, where it's critical because it's only produced as a byproduct of other commodities. There's only a couple of places in the world where germanium forms its own minerals. One up here in Kapushi, the other in Sumeb, and Caitlin Stewart, one of our MSc students, looked at material from these places, and you can see some sections here where there's sphalerite, tennantite, chalcopyrite, bornite, and rhyniorite in the section. And in a bit of the rock here, you can also see rhyniorite labeled as these fairly small blobs. So the major use of germanium is for semiconductors. And as I said, it's often a byproduct of zinc mining. And up in this Kapushi area, Ivanhoe are reopening a mine to target this big zinc area here, and they will be obviously producing germanium as a byproduct. The major suppliers of germanium are China. You can see Bolivia and Russia here, but also a little bit produced from South Africa as well. And germanium occurs in coals, and there's a move to try and remove the germanium from these burnt coals. Titanium, I think.
Continue, I'm going to just fix this noise.
Yes, titanium, I think everybody knows, comes from Richards Bay, as we see in this picture here. And there is also considerable deposits of titanium in sands over in Saldanha Bay. But it's also important that there are deposits as you go all the way up the coast to as far as Kenya. Those commodities may be as ilmenite, iron titanium oxide, or it might be as rutile, titanium TiO2. And titanium has a number of uses, but one of the things that is an increasing use is for pipe work in desalination plants. And as we go forwards, when water is going to become a big issue, the use of titanium for this piping is probably going to be important. Similarly, zircon, zirconium comes from zircon in these sands, the same sort of sands that produce the titanium. And one of the major uses for zirconium is in nuclear power reactors. And going forward for energy, we are going to need much more zirconium. You can see that South Africa is the second biggest producer of zirconium, and that's coming from these mineral sands. Zirconium can be used for all sorts of things together with titanium. It can be used in dental and sunblock, various things, but also as gemstones, the poor man's diamond in producing gemstones. Tellurium is something that is extremely important for solar paneling. And if you look here, you can see that there are different layers in these solar panels, one of which is a cadmium telluride. And so when you look at something like this Jasper solar farm near Kimberley, it has 325,000 photovoltaic panels. And as we go forward, this slice of the pie for these solar panels is going to get considerably larger. So we also have tellurium in parts of the bushveld. And these are slides from the Platte Reef team that we've had here over time. You can see the Platte Reef in this line here, extending about 30 kilometers from Mokopane in the south, northwards up the northern limb. The picture shown here is of the Anglo-Platinum operations at this part of the Platte Reef here. And you can see some pictures from Dave Hutchinson's work at a postdoc of mine back in about 2005. And you can see pictures there of platinum, palladium, bismutho-tellurides. So as more mining happens underground in the northern limb, both by Ivanplats and by PTM, we're going to have more bismuth and tellurium available to be produced from South Africa. Now, what's concerning is if you look at things that are in a cell phone, here's a typical array of elements, and you can see that those in this color here, such as copper, silver, gold, nickel, recovered at a greater than 50% recycle rate. But what's very worrying is that if you look at these rare earths here, you see that the recycle rate is actually less than 1%. So that's actually of considerable concern. So what has Africa got to offer for a greener future? Major elements throughout Africa, and minor elements such as germanium, selenium, tellurium, all of those are available throughout Africa too. And you can see that South Africa has a slice of the pie for a number of those commodities. So the diversity of elements, as I said at the beginning, will continue. With the increased reliance on computing, the fourth industrial revolution, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, etc., and the Internet of Things, we'll need more and more and more metals. But when we, although I've emphasized the African contribution, it's relatively small compared to China. You can see here, this line is DRC, and they produce a significant amount of cobalt and a significant amount of tantalum from pegmatites. Here is South Africa in this line, producing large chunks of the world's chromium, manganese, PGMs, titanium, vanadium, zirconium, which we've covered. But when you look at this diagram on the right here, you can see that China has the largest slice of the pie for a whole number of these elements. So what does I've shown you what Africa has to offer. What does Africa itself need? Well, Africa needs cement and bricks for housing. It needs water for irrigation. It needs fertilizer and a better quality seeds and storage capacity for crops that have been grown, and also better access to markets. But people also need fair wages, and this is something that in some countries they're not getting from the mining industry. We also need better education over much of Africa and access to that education in rural areas. So the question is for the young of you, what do you want for your children? What Africa needs isn't being considered enough, and we need to have more beneficiation of commodities within this continent. There's been a considerable improvement in this millennium, but we still need to see a lot more. So there are arguments against nuclear, oil and coal, but not everybody is happy with a wind turbine in their backyard. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Judith. That was fantastic. Let's take some questions from the room first while I try to fix the speakers so we can hear the people.
Yes.
Scott.
Thank you, that was great. Thanks. I had a question about cobalt. It just seems like there's something unique about the chemistry of the fluids and stuff in the copper belt that gave rise to this big cobalt deposit in the DRC. Do you think there's any other places in Africa we could be mining cobalt, because there's a lot of I'd say a lot of challenges, right, with
the DRC? Yeah. Cobalt is a byproduct of PGM mining. So we are producing cobalt from the bushveld and from the Great Dyke, but not anywhere near the quantities that the world needs that's coming from the DRC. Some of the issues over child labor and such are being sorted, because there's now, the Germans are fingerprinting certain things like tin, tantalum and such, so that you can prove where these things come from. And also America, for example, is actually ensuring that their companies can provide compliance, that they're not purchasing any tantalum or cobalt from mines where there has been an issue. So hopefully DRC is improving, but we can get cobalt from other sources.
Great. I'm just going to ask the online audience if they can type their questions in the chat, because we have no speakers, unfortunately. They are being, they have gremlins today. So Sue, you want to come up and, yeah, if you don't mind. If you can, the virtual audience, if you can type your questions in the chat, that would be great.
Hi, Judith, thanks. I wanted to ask, the electric vehicles versus hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, is some of that being driven by the politics of the unavailability or the risk seen with platinum? And then also on graphite, is that also something that's you mentioned it, but I just wondered if it plays a larger role.
My co-author sitting in the audience is better able to answer on graphite than I can. Would you like to come and answer the graphite first, and then I'll do the hydrogen cards?
For graphite, grain size is the primary driver in terms of quality of a deposit. Africa certainly has significant graphite resources. I think the first sort of recent new operating mine is in Tanzania, but certainly the East African orogenic belt going from Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, particularly in northeast Mozambique, has got a lot of graphite projects at the moment. There are also at least 2 graphite projects in Madagascar, one of which I think is under construction. I'm not 100% sure. So yes, graphite is going to be mined in Africa. People are ramping up. There's always this question about, won't graphene be important, and synthetic graphene? And I think graphene tends to be able to be produced in very limited amounts, and it's also fairly small and very expensive. So it's always the case of what is a commercially viable process to obtain some of these synthetic versions of what we need. I'll leave Judith to talk about fuel cells versus.
The hydrogen powered cars are something for the hydrogen power, I think, is something for the future. And that's quite important, because if we go to lithium ion totally in our batteries for the cars, we use a lot less platinum than in other cars. However, hydrogen is being used. There's a good example from the Orkneys, and the Orkneys, which are a set of islands to the north of the UK, have almighty winds, and so they have lots of wind power, and they're producing more energy than they can actually use. And so what they're doing with that extra energy is taking water, and there's no shortage of that in the Orkneys either, and using the energy to produce hydrogen. And so they've got hydrogen-powered cars on those islands using the hydrogen that they've produced. The problem is you've got to produce the hydrogen, and that uses energy. So there's the cost-energy balance there that needs to be looked at. But I think hydrogen is the way to go for the future. And we're seeing Anglo-American with some of these big haul trucks being run on hydrogen. Come on.
Okay, we have 6.
Just to add something pertinent to whether fuel cells or electric vehicles with lithium-ion batteries, or whatever kind of batteries, will become the technology of the future. I think it probably is going to be a blended system, such that in some places where you can produce green hydrogen, i.e. hydrogen from renewable energy, that will be much more favored in terms of fuel cells, whereas electric vehicles may well be more dominant in other places. It's a little bit like, and this is showing our ages, those of you that understand me, the VHS Betamax debate of the 1970s. For those of you too young to remember, there were 2 video formats, VHS and Betamax. Betamax was always thought of as the technologically more advanced form, whereas VHS was the form that was adopted by companies because potentially the company that was majorly manufacturing them got a bigger market share earlier. So it was sort of commercial instincts and commercial reasons which resulted in the adoption of VHS as the major format, not necessarily the best technology, although that is a matter of debate. I think it's going to be the same thing for a lot of things moving forward in the green economy. It's going to be what gets adopted first and is more commercially viable first than necessarily the best technology, depending on legislation, depending on take-up by the public.
Okay, we have a question. Thank you, Paul. We have a question from Charles Day. He says, is there any move between Africa, China, Russia, and Australia to create a cartel like OPEC in order to maintain prices of critical metals, which sounds like a great idea.
It sounds like a good idea. And certainly China are making a huge move into Africa at the moment. They've got chrome mines, they've got lithium mines, and Paul and I were in Zimbabwe a few weeks ago doing a lithium project, and the Chinese there are setting up a metals park. And they're going to do processing beneficiation of a whole range of commodities, from including lithium, platinum, nickel, and cobalt. Certainly the Chinese have a big move into African mining. Australians also are big into lithium, uranium in Africa. Russia is, sorry, Marina, not politically popular at the moment, but I can't see a cartel being developed like that in my lifetime. It's a good idea, but.
Okay, we have one or two more questions. Here's a question from Alan Jones. I won't read the whole thing, but he's suggesting that human resources for this kind of demand is going to be important in the next few decades. And this is a very important question. What can we do to make earth sciences, especially mining exploration, more attractive to students coming out of high school?
I think that's a difficult question that more knowledgeable people than myself have been working on. We're very aware of that in this country, because instead of having about 30 students in honours, Stellenbosch, I think last year had about 10, UJ had about 8. We kept our numbers up, but again, Pretoria was less than 10. I'm the external examiner, so I go there every year and meet the students. So I don't know how we can make it more attractive, but I think it's a case of when the mining was going full swing here in Southern Africa, prior to the 2008 crash, there were lots of students came into geology because they perceived the opportunity for jobs and wages. As we go forward, and as mining will take a bigger role in the world economy to produce all these metals that I've been talking about, I think it will become somewhat more popular. But the problem is mining to the great masses out there means coal, and mining in my backyard, no. And my friend John Hancock's had somebody go into his office recently and say, you're in mining and that's bad. And John said, did you drive here? And the person said, yes. Do you have a cell phone? Yes. Off you go, you're using mined components. So we've got to get the message across to society as a whole, not just because that I think will attract students.
Okay, maybe one more question if you have time, Judith. One more. I think this is a good one about especially in the South African context, about the northern limb. Is tellurium mineable there? Is it economic to mine?
Well, I've been trying to find out where the tellurium is going. And when I've checked, it says that there is an output from tellurium and that is being sold by South Africa. But my feeling is that a lot of it is possibly going onto the tailings. So it's something that I think Glenn Nwila and the Mining Institute are interested in looking at. But essentially, I'm not absolutely sure on that.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us. It's been fantastic. There are a few more questions in the chat. Maybe Judith has time, she can stay around and answer those. But thank you all for coming. And someone did ask whether these slides will be available. They will be on YouTube if Judith agrees.
Yeah, sure.
Have the talk then. So you'll be able to find them on YouTube if you like. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week. Hopefully. Cheers. Very big one. Yeah.
Supposed to give